In the spring of 1241, the world held its breath. To the east, a storm of unparalleled destructive power had swept across Asia, obliterating empires that had stood for centuries. The Mongol war machine, forged by Genghis Khan and perfected by his successors, had reached the very edge of the European continent. At the Battle of Legnica in Poland, and shortly after at the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, the flower of European chivalry, the heavily armored knights of the Teutonic Order, the Templars, and the royal hosts of Eastern Europe were not just defeated. They were annihilated. The European armies were lured into traps, surrounded by a rain of arrows, and butchered with a tactical precision that the West could not even comprehend. The King of Hungary fled for his life. The path to the heart of Europe lay wide open. There was no army left on the continent that could stop the Mongol horde. Vienna was next, then Paris, then Rome. But then a miracle occurred, or depending on your perspective, a historical accident that saved Western civilization. In December 1241, the great Khan Ogedei, the son of Genghis Khan, died of alcohol poisoning in the Mongol capital of Karakorum. By Mongol law, all princes and senior generals had to return to the homeland to elect a new leader. Batu Khan, the commander of the Western forces, and Subutai, the greatest military strategist of the age, packed up their armies, turned their horses eastward, and left Europe. They never returned. But history is a fragile tapestry woven from the threads of chance. What if Ogedei Khan had lived another 10 years? What if the Mongol leadership had decided that the wealth of Western Europe was too great a prize to abandon? What if the messenger bearing the news of the Khan's death had been thrown from his horse and died in the snows of the Eurasian steppe? If the Mongols had not turned back in 1241, the history of the world would have been violently, irrevocably rewritten. The Dark Ages would not have gently transitioned into the Renaissance. Instead, Europe would have been plunged into a crucible of fire, blood, and unprecedented transformation. This is the story of the timeline that never was. This is what would have happened if the Mongols had invaded Europe. To understand the sheer scale of the catastrophe that awaited Western Europe, we must first understand the state of the continent in 1241. Europe was not a unified entity. It was a fractured, bickering collection of feudal kingdoms, deeply divided by a bitter power struggle between the papacy and the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II. Pope Gregory IX had actually excommunicated Frederick, absolving his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. When the Mongols arrived at the borders of Christendom, the Pope and the Emperor were too busy fighting each other to mount a coordinated defense. When Subutai and Batu Khan resumed their westward march in the spring of 1242, their target was the Holy Roman Empire and the Kingdom of France. Subutai was a master of intelligence and psychological warfare. He had already sent spies disguised as merchants into Europe years prior. He knew about the political divisions, the layout of the roads, and the locations of the pastures needed to feed his massive cavalry force. The first major obstacle was the geography of Central Europe. The Mongol military machine was built for the vast open grasslands of the Eurasian steppe. Their primary weapon, the composite bow, had a range of over 300 meters and could pierce the thickest chainmail. But Europe was a land of dense, dark forests, treacherous mountains, and damp, muddy valleys. Furthermore, the European climate was wet, and the glue on the Mongol composite bows was known to lose its tension in high humidity. The European nobility, recovering from the shock of the initial raids, believed that their stone castles would save them. They retreated behind the thick walls of their fortresses, expecting the Mongols to starve outside, lacking the patience for prolonged sieges. This was a fatal miscalculation. The Mongols were not just horse archers, they were the most adaptable military force in human history. As they had done in China and Persia, the Mongols brought with them a corps of captive engineers. When they reached the walled cities of Germany and Austria, they did not simply ride around them. They constructed massive counter-fortifications, built towering trebuchets, and deployed early forms of gunpowder weaponry, bombs, and incendiary devices that the Europeans had never seen before. The psychological terror of the Mongol siege was absolute. If a city surrendered immediately, its inhabitants were spared, though heavily taxed and conscripted. If a city resisted, every single man, woman, and child was put to the sword, and the city was burned to the ground. Word of this brutal binary choice spread faster than the Mongol army. By the time the horde reached the Rhine River, many German cities simply opened their gates, offering tribute and hostages to avoid annihilation. The Holy Roman Emperor Frederick II finally managed to assemble a massive coalition army. Tens of thousands of heavily armored knights, supported by infantry and crossbowmen, met the Mongol vanguard on the plains of Bavaria. Frederick relied on the shock charge of his heavy cavalry, a tactic that had dominated European battlefields for centuries. But Subutai did not fight like a European. As the armored knights charged, the Mongol light cavalry simply parted, refusing to engage in melee combat. They unleashed clouds of arrows that found the gaps in the knights' armor, targeting their unarmored horses. When the European charge inevitably slowed, bogged down by exhaustion and the sheer weight of their armor, the Mongol heavy cavalry, armed with lances and maces, flanked them. It was a massacre. The Holy Roman Empire's military power was broken in a single afternoon. Frederick II was killed in the rout, and the political structure of Central Europe collapsed into anarchy. With the German states subjugated, the Mongol war machine turned its sights on France. King Louis IX, a deeply pious monarch who would later be canonized as a saint, called for a holy war. But this was not a crusade to reclaim Jerusalem. This was a crusade for the survival of Christendom. The Mongols invaded France in the winter of 1243. The frozen rivers provided perfect highways for their horses. Paris, the largest and wealthiest city in Western Europe, was besieged. The siege lasted 3 months. The French fought with desperate fanaticism, but starvation and Mongol siege engines eventually breached the walls. The sack of Paris was a cataclysmic event. The great cathedrals, the repositories of ancient knowledge, and the royal palaces were looted and burned. King Louis IX was captured and executed, his head reportedly sent back to the Great Khan in Karakorum as a trophy. The fall of Paris sent shockwaves across the continent. The psychological spine of Western Europe was broken. The Mongols had proven that the Christian God could not protect his people from the wrath of the steppe. But the ultimate prize for the Mongols was not Paris, it was Rome. The Pope was the spiritual leader of the European resistance. If the Mongols could break the papacy, they would break the soul of Europe. In 1245, the Mongol armies crossed the Alps. The mountainous terrain of Italy was difficult, but Subutai utilized local conscripts, conquered Germans and Frenchmen to clear paths and serve as infantry. The Papal States were defended by a coalition of Italian city-states, but they were hopelessly outmatched. When the Mongols reached Rome, Pope Innocent IV refused to flee. He stood on the steps of St. Peter's Basilica, surrounded by his Swiss guard and loyal clergy, praying for divine intervention. The Mongols did not care for the theology of the conquered. Rome was sacked with a ruthlessness that surpassed the Visigoths and the Vandals centuries earlier. The Pope was captured. In a display of calculated political theater, the Mongol commanders did not kill him immediately. Instead, they forced him to issue a papal bull declaring the Great Khan to be the scourge of God, a divine instrument sent to punish Christians for their sins. After this ultimate humiliation, the Pope was executed. The death of the Pope and the sacking of Rome triggered a profound theological crisis in Europe. The Catholic Church, which had been the unifying identity of Western Europe for nearly a millennium, was decapitated. The College of Cardinals fled to remote monasteries in Spain and the British Isles, but the central authority of the Church was shattered. This brings us to the edge of the known world for the Mongols, the English Channel. By 1246, the Mongol Empire stretched from the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic coast of France. But the Mongols were a land power. They had no naval tradition. Across the narrow strip of water lay the Kingdom of England, ruled by King Henry III. England became a fortress of paranoia. Knowing that the Mongols would eventually find a way across, the English militarized their entire society. They built massive coastal defenses and maintained a constant watch. The Mongols did attempt to cross. They forced the conquered shipwrights of Venice and Genoa to build a massive invasion fleet. However, the Mongols were terrible sailors, and the English Channel is notoriously treacherous. A combination of fierce storms and desperate suicidal attacks by English fire ships destroyed the Mongol armada before it could make landfall. Realizing that an amphibious invasion was too costly, the Mongols opted for a different strategy: absolute isolation. They established a massive naval blockade, cutting England off from all continental trade. England survived, but it became an impoverished, highly militarized, and deeply xenophobic island entirely cut off from the rapid changes occurring on the mainland. On the continent, the conquest was complete, but conquering Europe was one thing, ruling it was another. The Mongols established the Horde of the Setting Sun, a new khanate with its capital in the ruins of Paris, later moved to a newly constructed, sprawling administrative city on the Danube. To rule the millions of European subjects, the Mongols implemented their standard imperial policy, brutal suppression of rebellion combined with absolute religious tolerance and meritocratic administration. The Mongols did not care if their subjects were Catholic, Orthodox, or pagan, as long as they paid their taxes. This religious tolerance had a devastating long-term effect on the Catholic Church. Without the backing of kings and emperors, the Church lost its monopoly on power. Alternative Christian sects, like the Cathars and the Waldensians, which had been brutally suppressed by the Inquisition in our timeline, flourished under Mongol rule. Furthermore, the Mongols brought with them Nestorian Christians, Muslims, and Buddhists. Europe became a melting pot of Eastern and Western religions. The absolute, dogmatic grip of the papacy was gone forever. Economically, the integration of Europe into the Mongol Empire triggered an era of unprecedented globalization. The Pax Mongolica, the Mongol peace, ensured that a merchant could travel from the shores of France to the capital of China with a gold plate on his head without being molested. The Silk Road was extended all the way to the Atlantic. European merchants gained direct access to the wealth of the East. Spices, silk, porcelain, and paper flooded into Europe. In return, European silver, timber, and wool flowed into the Mongol treasury. The Italian city-states of Venice and Genoa, having submitted to the Mongols early on, became the vital middlemen of this transcontinental trade, growing fabulously wealthy. But this unbroken overland connection between East and West brought with it a microscopic passenger that would change the course of history. In our timeline, the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347 via Genoese trading ships from the Black Sea. In this alternate timeline, the direct high-volume overland trade routes established by the Mongols brought the bubonic plague to Europe a century earlier. In the early 1250s, the Black Death struck the Mongol capital on the Danube. From there, it spread rapidly along the perfectly maintained Mongol highway system. Paris, Rome, and the densely populated towns of Germany were decimated. Because the European population was already stressed by the recent conquests and the disruption of traditional agriculture, the mortality rate was even higher than in our timeline. Nearly 60% of Europe's population perished in a span of 5 years. For the native Europeans, it was the apocalypse. But for the Mongol Empire, it was a logistical problem to be solved with characteristic ruthlessness. To maintain tax revenues and agricultural output, the Great Khan ordered the mass relocation of populations from other parts of the empire. Hundreds of thousands of Chinese farmers, Persian artisans, and Turkic herdsmen were forcibly resettled in the depopulated lands of France, Germany, and Italy. By the year 1300, the demographic makeup of Western Europe had been permanently altered. The cities of the former Holy Roman Empire were now cosmopolitan hubs where Latin, French, and German mixed with Persian, Mandarin, and Mongolian. European architecture began to incorporate sweeping, curved roofs and intricate tilework. The food, the clothing, and the language of Europe were forever hybridized. Technologically, the Mongol occupation accelerated European development by centuries. The Mongols were great patrons of engineering and science. They brought Chinese blast furnaces to Europe, revolutionizing iron and steel production. Most importantly, they brought gunpowder. In our timeline, gunpowder trickled into Europe slowly, taking centuries to revolutionize warfare. Under the Mongols, the technology was transferred directly and rapidly. By the late 13th century, European blacksmiths, working under Mongol overseers, were manufacturing early cannons and matchlock firearms. The era of the armored knight, which had already been dealt a death blow by the Mongol composite bow, was entirely eradicated by the widespread use of firearms. Furthermore, the Mongols introduced paper money and advanced credit systems to Europe. The concept of fiat currency, backed by the immense wealth and authority of the Great Khan, replaced the cumbersome barter and coin systems of feudal Europe. This financial revolution laid the groundwork for early capitalism centuries ahead of schedule. But no empire lasts forever. The Mongol Empire was inherently unstable, reliant on the personal charisma and military genius of its rulers. As the decades passed, the vast distances of the empire made centralized control impossible. By the 1320s, the Mongol Empire fractured. The Western Khanate, cut off from the Mongolian homeland, began to drift. The Mongol rulers in Europe, a tiny minority ruling over a massive hybridized population, faced a choice: assimilate or be overthrown. They chose assimilation. The descendants of Batu Khan and Subutai intermarried with the European nobility. They adopted local customs, though they maintained their elite military traditions. The rulers of the Western Khanate eventually converted to a syncretic religion that blended elements of Tengrism, Catholicism, and Buddhism. However, the native European population, though heavily mixed with Eastern immigrants, never forgot their subjugation. In the mid-14th century, a massive, coordinated rebellion erupted across the continent. Armed with the very gunpowder weapons the Mongols had introduced, a coalition of French, German, and Italian warlords rose up against the Khanate. The resulting war was brutal, but the Mongol grip was finally broken. By 1380, the last Mongol Khan of Europe was overthrown in Paris, but the Europe that emerged from the ashes of the Western Khanate was entirely unrecognizable from the Europe of 1241. Feudalism was dead. The Mongols had systematically dismantled the hereditary rights of the nobility, replacing them with a centralized, meritocratic bureaucracy. When the Europeans reclaimed their continent, they did not return to the decentralized fiefdoms of the Middle Ages. Instead, they maintained the highly efficient, centralized administrative states the Mongols had built. The concept of the absolute centralized nation-state was born in Europe 300 years early. The Catholic Church never recovered its absolute authority. The religious pluralism enforced by the Mongols had taken root. Europe became a continent of competing faiths and philosophies, leading to an earlier and perhaps less bloody Enlightenment. Without a single dogmatic religious authority to suppress dissenting ideas, scientific inquiry flourished. The Renaissance, when it came, was not sparked by the rediscovery of classical Greek and Roman texts fleeing the fall of Constantinople. Instead, it was a Eurasian Renaissance. European scholars, having had direct access to the libraries of China, India, and Persia for over a century, synthesized Eastern mathematics, astronomy, and medicine with Western philosophy. The printing press, brought overland from China in the 1200s, was already in widespread use across Europe by the time the Mongols were expelled. The explosion of knowledge was rapid and uncontrollable. Geopolitically, the map of Europe was forever changed. The Holy Roman Empire never reformed. Germany remained a collection of highly militarized, technologically advanced city-states. France emerged as a dominant, centralized superpower, its culture a unique blend of Latin and Asian influences. And what of the Age of Discovery? In our timeline, Europeans took to the seas in the 15th century to find a route to the riches of Asia because the Ottoman Empire had blocked the overland trade routes. In this alternate timeline, the overland routes had been open for centuries. The wealth of Asia was already in Europe. Therefore, the desperate push across the Atlantic might never have happened. Christopher Columbus might have lived and died as a simple merchant in a cosmopolitan Mongol-influenced Genoa. The Americas might have remained isolated from the Old World for centuries longer. Alternatively, the heavily militarized, technologically advanced nations of this new Europe, armed with gunpowder and driven by a fiercely competitive, centralized state system, might have turned their eyes to the oceans not for trade, but for conquest. When they finally did cross the Atlantic, the technological gap between Europe and the indigenous peoples of the Americas would have been even wider, leading to an even more rapid and devastating colonization. The Mongol invasion of Europe was a historical near miss, a ghost ship that passed in the night. The death of one man, Ogedei Khan, saved Western Europe from a conquest that would have erased its political, religious, and cultural identity. If the Mongols had stayed, the Dark Ages would have been violently terminated. The resulting civilization would have been born in blood and subjugation, but it would have emerged centuries ahead of our timeline in terms of technology, globalization, and administrative efficiency. It would have been a world without the absolute dominance of the Catholic Church, without the traditional feudal system, and with a culture that was as much Asian as it was European. History is not a predetermined path, it is a chaotic web of accidents, decisions, and sheer luck. The Europe we know today, its borders, its religions, its philosophies, and its global dominance exists only because a messenger rode out of the east in the winter of 1241, carrying the news of a dead Khan. It makes you wonder, what messages are being carried today that will alter the course of the future? And what empires of tomorrow are waiting in the wings, just one accident away from changing the world forever? Thank you for exploring this alternate history with us. If you found this journey into the past fascinating, be sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let us know in the comments. Do you think a Mongol-ruled Europe would have eventually conquered the rest of the world? Or would it have collapsed under its own weight? Until next time, keep questioning the history you know.